Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we're on Battleship New Jersey's flight deck all the way at the fantail, and we're going to talk about some of the remnants of evidence that the ship carried aircraft. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the helicopters which would have used these landing facilities. So, obviously we've got a whole flight deck here that's remnant enough to prove it, but what are some of the other features around here, and is there anything that relates to the drones that we carried in the 80s and 90s? Not to spoil it, but yes. So behind me, you can see where helicopters are lining up and trying to land. You'll also notice that there are two lines of other hash marks around here, depending on the size of the helicopter that's trying to land. So, what is important here for a helicopter pilot? Well, it depends on the time period for what direction a helicopter is approaching the battleship from. During Vietnam, when the fantail is initially turned into a helicopter landing pad, and it was one in the 50s, but it didn't really have any specific markings. Helicopters were so new, small, and primitive that they didn't need any. But by the Vietnam War, helicopters were supposed to land sideways. This is because the ship had its old aviation crane on the fantail, which was also used to lower the ship's boats into the water. So, obviously helicopters can't come from dead astern, they've got to come straight across the side of the ship. In that configuration, you'll see there's a circle with a straight line coming right across the back of the ship. So the helicopters are lining up on that white line, coming to the middle of the circle and then touching down. You'll notice that flight deck is only large enough to accommodate one helicopter. That was a problem. So in the 1980s, they extended the flight deck with two additional structures on each side of the various ventilating ducts in the middle of the ship, which they could not move or build a flight deck over, and made parking spaces for helicopters. And we've got remnants of how you would park helicopters here on the ship. You'll see these circles welded into the deck with crosses into them. These are the tie-down points for aircraft, so you could tie them down into these hooks. Now, either when the ship was in mothballs or when the ship opened up as a museum, these were filled in with material, probably concrete, or in some cases cut off or welded over entirely, so that they were not tripping hazards for people. However, they still show there's all sorts of places around here you can tie helicopters down, because you don't know which one's landing on here, and it might not even be one of the standard American helicopters. It may be some other NATO ally, or even something that wasn't even designed when the ship was built. So they just have them all over the place so you can tie down all sorts of stuff, whatever you need. So, having talked about the Vietnam layout, in the 1980s, they added a boat boom on the port side, so they were able to delete the aviation crane and turn that space into a Nixie torpedo decoy area. This meant helicopters could land more coming from the back of the ship. However, the flagstaff was in the way. So initially in the 80s, the flight deck had a diagonal line painted across it, and helicopters were supposed to come in diagonally. Well, this proved complicated. It's real easy to line up on a ship's wake, even at night, to come in and land. And so, about halfway through the 80s commission, they decide to completely reorganize the ship's helicopter facilities, and they basically just put a hinge on the flagstaff, much like the jackstaff at the bow has always had, so that you can take it down when you're going to be firing the guns forward or when you're not in port anymore flying a jack, so that the flagstaff can come down and the helicopter can come right in from the stern and line up on this straight white line. So, besides the white line, which we have painted as a museum, it was pretty well wasted away when we got the ship from the Navy. So besides this, which we have reproduced, what evidence is there of these two landing techniques? So please pardon the tables and chairs here. Our fantail is an amazing event space where we do weddings, retirement ceremonies, board meetings, conferences, all sorts of stuff. And we can fit hundreds of people back here for events. So right now the space is set up like that, but we're working around it. So right here is one of the landing lights that a helicopter could line up on in darkness. You'll notice that very specifically there's a notch cut into it pointing that way. So this light is part of the remnants of that original 80s diagonal landing pattern. So let's see where it points. If we follow this across the flight deck, boom, we hit another one. So even though they changed how the landing pattern worked on this ship, they didn't bother to go back and cut these out and replace them. Except for the one that was right here. Here we only have the weld marks reminding us that there used to be one. I'm not sure why this one in particular was removed, but all of the other ones are still in place. Such as this one right here, and then the first one over here. Now right next to this one, we have one of the later 80s editions, which you'll notice has the notch cut into it in this direction and lines up perfectly with a row going right down here. So this is what helicopters would line up on if they are coming in for a later 80s straight approach off the fantail, which proved to be the easiest method used. Now, why are these not centerline where the line is? Why are these offset all the way over here? I couldn't tell you for sure, but helicopter pilots are like British people. They fly from the right-hand side of the cockpit, not from the left-hand side. So it's not surprising that the lights are on the pilot's side as opposed to in the center or on the other side of the ship. So Battleship New Jersey has fuel for propelling the ship. The ship also has aviation gasoline for helicopters, and we can refuel helicopters on board. When drones were added, which burned a different gasoline than the ship or the helicopters, they needed to add a tank for that. They used one of the old 40mm gun tubs here at the fantail, and they added basically a bladder that would hold the gasoline. I think it's something like 200 gallons. But these drones didn't have long ranges. They weren't particularly large. They didn't need much gas. So they didn't need a lot of space, and they didn't need to take up interior space with a fuel tank, because if that explodes, that causes issues. So it's right here, and you can still see it down there. The bladder sits on a rolling cart that is sitting on rails that are attached to an opening that was cut in the back of this gun tub. That is so that if there is a fire on the flight deck, if one of these drones crashes like they were prone to do, or if a helicopter crashes, then there's a fire, it's spreading, we got flammable stuff right here, well, you just pull a lever and it drops into the ocean. Fuel is lighter than water, so you can always circle back around and pick it up if you need to, but it's just 200 gallons of fuel, so who cares? You can pick more up later if needed. You'll notice we still have the purple painted aviation refueling wheel and the refueling nozzle and hose here. So lots of evidence that that drone was here, and we've got one more feature here on the starboard side of the flight deck. There was a damage control party on this ship purely devoted to flight crashes that had their own locker back here at the fantail, and right here off of the landing deck is a firefighting station. We've got regular fire hoses and a place to hook them up for water, and we've got AFFF coming from a firefighting foam mixing station right below us, and there's one of these on each side of the flight deck. In the event of the fire, the lever that you would pull is nowhere near the bladder back there, so you don't have to run through the whole possibly burning flight deck where a helicopter's just crashed to pull the lever. And it sits right here in the gunnel. It is a simple piece of steel pipe that has a wire attached to it, and when you lift that up, the wire pulls and it just cuts that cart loose and drops into the ocean. Finally, while we're back here, one final feature of the flight deck that was added in the 80s are these railings that are completely different from the other railings around the ship, many of which date to when the ship was first built in World War II. Those railings were mostly all originally designed to be foldable for various reasons, primarily so you could nest multiple ships up next to each other in port, and wherever you're going to have the gangways connecting them, you can just fold down the railings. However, with helicopters, you don't want protrusions like this sticking up when they're coming in for a landing. But you do still want a net so that if there's no railing and somebody falls overboard, you can catch them. So these railings are all hinged and they're netted, whereas the other railings only have cables to them. And they can be lowered during flight operations and then brought back up afterwards. Have you ever gotten to ride in a helicopter before? I've never been. Flown on airplanes a couple of times, but never a helicopter. Let us know about your experience in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, as well as a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. The support you guys have given us has really allowed us to make the channel something special, and we appreciate it. If you'd like to continue supporting us, there's a link in the description below. You can also support the museum by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about us. Thanks for watching.